The screaming stopped at exactly 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in 1992, but the scratching in the walls continued for another 6 hours. What the emergency responders found in that remote Appalachian cabin would haunt them for decades, and it was just the beginning of a pattern that law enforcement had been willfully ignoring for generations. The mountains of Appalachia have always harbored secrets, but some families took isolation to depths that defy human understanding. Deputy Silas Blackthorne had been called to investigate reports of disturbances at the Holloway property in eastern Kentucky. The gravel road leading to their compound crunched under his patrol car's tires, releasing the acrid smell of sulfur from nearby coal seams mixed with something sweetly rotten that made his throat close. The morning mist clung to his windshield like desperate fingers. What Blackthorne discovered wasn't just a crime scene, it was evidence of a multi-generational system of control that had operated in plain sight. The Holloway family had been perfecting their methods for over a century, passing down techniques through bloodlines that understood the value of geographic isolation and community silence. Inside the main cabin, Blackthorne found journals dating back to 1868. Each entry detailed experiments in psychological conditioning, written in the same careful handwriting across 4 different generations. The pages revealed a family obsessed with creating what they called perfect compliance through methods that would make professional torturers recoil. From Sheriff's Report, Pike County, Kentucky, October 15, 1992. Multiple restraint devices discovered in basement level. Subjects appeared to have been conditioned over extended periods. County coroner requests additional forensic support. But the Holloways weren't unique. Throughout the Appalachian region, 3 families developed their own twisted legacies, each believing they had discovered fundamental truths about human nature that civilization was too weak to embrace. They shared one common thread they all understood: that isolation breeds impunity. The first family convinced an entire town to participate in their rituals. The second family turned child rearing into a laboratory of psychological horror. And the third family? They discovered that the line between medicine and torture disappears entirely when no one is watching. Local authorities had received reports about all 3 families for decades. Social workers filed concerns that mysteriously disappeared from official records. Neighbors whispered stories that were dismissed as mountain folklore. Even when evidence surfaced, it was often buried under layers of bureaucracy and willful ignorance. Blackthorne's hands shook as he photographed the basement workshop where the Holloways had refined their craft. Homemade devices lined the walls, contraptions designed not to kill quickly, but to modify behavior over months and years. The family had been operating with scientific precision, documenting every technique, every breakthrough in their quest to remake human consciousness. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the realization that the Holloways had been sharing their methods. Letters found in a hidden compartment revealed correspondence with similar families across 3 states. They weren't isolated madmen, they were part of a network. The question that haunted Blackthorne wasn't just how the Holloways had operated undetected for so long. It was how many other families might still be out there, continuing traditions that turned children into experiments and communities into accomplices. Before we dive deeper into these generational nightmares, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story is already getting under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover gets much darker. But understanding the Holloways means going back to where it all began, to a coal mining town in 1928, where a charismatic preacher named Amos Crowley convinced an entire congregation that suffering was the purest form of worship. Amos Crowley stood at the pulpit every Sunday morning, his voice echoing off the rough-hewn walls of the Salvation Creek Chapel, while children in the front pew bore fresh welts that the congregation pretended not to see. This wasn't just religious fervor, it was the systematic conditioning of an entire community to accept the unthinkable as divine will. The coal mining town of Salvation Creek needed to believe in something stronger than the black lung disease that was killing their fathers and the company store debts that enslaved their families. The chapel itself seemed designed for suffering. Splintered wooden pews that left splinters in worshippers' legs, windows positioned to let in harsh morning light that burned tired eyes, and a stone floor so cold that barefoot children would develop frostbite during winter services. But Crowley preached that comfort was the enemy of salvation. From the personal diary of Martha Hensley, March 12, 1929. Brother Crowley says little Sarah's crying during service shows she ain't been properly prepared. He's offered to help us train her better. God forgive me. I said yes. Crowley had arrived in Salvation Creek 3 years earlier, claiming to be a reformed sinner who had discovered the true path to redemption through what he called purification rituals. The town's previous preacher had died in a mine collapse, leaving the community spiritually adrift and vulnerable to anyone who spoke with authority about divine purpose. The rituals began small, extra-long prayer sessions where children were expected to kneel on rough stone until their knees bled, fasting periods that left families weak and disoriented, public confessions where community members were encouraged to reveal their neighbors' private shames. But Crowley's true genius lay in making the congregation complicit. He convinced parents that their children's pain was necessary for salvation. He taught wives that their husbands' brutal discipline was godly love. He transformed an entire community into willing participants in systematic abuse by wrapping it in scripture and salvation. By 1930, nearly every family in Salvation Creek had surrendered their children to Crowley's spiritual guidance. The preacher maintained detailed records of each child's progress, documenting which methods produced the most complete submission. He was particularly interested in breaking what he called willful spirits, children who showed independence or creativity. The town's isolation worked in Crowley's favor. Salvation Creek sat in a valley accessible only by a single mountain road that became impassable during winter months. No outside authorities visited regularly. No social services existed. The company that owned the mine cared only about coal production, not the spiritual practices of their workers. Parents who initially resisted found themselves ostracized by the community. Their children were excluded from church activities. Their families were denied help during emergencies. The social pressure was overwhelming. In a town where survival depended on cooperation, what would you do if your entire community turned against you for protecting your child? When conformity meant acceptance and resistance meant exile. Luther Coldwell was the town's only doctor, and his medical records from this period reveal a disturbing pattern. Broken bones attributed to spiritual discipline, malnutrition explained as fasting for faith, psychological trauma dismissed as temporary weakness that prayer would cure. From Dr. Luther Coldwell's medical notes, August 7, 1930. Young Timothy shows signs of severe psychological distress following his week of purification. Recommended psychiatric evaluation denied by parents. Community pressure prevents further intervention. Coldwell found himself trapped between his medical oath and community expectations. He began documenting everything, perhaps hoping that someday someone would investigate. His records would later become crucial evidence of how systematically Crowley had corrupted the town. The breaking point came during the winter of 1931, when 8-year-old Rebecca Stone died during one of Crowley's extended purification sessions. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but Coldwell's private notes told a different story. But Rebecca's death didn't end Crowley's influence. It strengthened it, because he convinced the community that her suffering had been so pure, so complete, that God had called her home as an example to others. Rebecca Stone's small body lay in the chapel for 3 days, while Amos Crowley preached about her glorious ascension. But what the congregation couldn't see were the restraint marks on her wrists, or the way her fingers had been systematically broken. Her death should have ended everything instead. It became the foundation for an even darker chapter in Salvation Creek's descent into collective madness. When an entire community agrees to call torture love, reality itself becomes negotiable. The chapel reeked of decay and burning candles, the sound of Crowley's voice bouncing off stone walls that seemed to absorb screams, while the rough wooden floor beneath the congregation's knees grew slick with their tears and blood. Rebecca's father, Jedediah Vexler, stood at the front of the church, nodding along as Crowley explained how his daughter's suffering had been a gift to us all. Vexler wasn't Rebecca's biological father. He had married her mother 2 years earlier, bringing his own twisted interpretation of Scripture into an already broken household. But watching him that day, listening to him thank God for his stepdaughter's death, the congregation began to understand that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. From the Salvation Creek Church Registry, January 20th, 1932, Brother Vexler has volunteered to lead our new children's purification ministry. His experience with young Rebecca has shown him the path to true spiritual breakthrough. Vexler had been Crowley's most devoted student, but Rebecca's death revealed that the student had surpassed the teacher. While Crowley spoke of suffering as spiritual cleansing, Vexler understood something darker, that breaking a child's will completely could create a perfect vessel for whatever beliefs you chose to pour into them. The Children's Purification Ministry became Salvation Creek's most guarded secret. Parents would volunteer their children for increasingly extreme spiritual training under Vexler's guidance. The sessions took place in the chapel basement, where thick stone walls muffled any sounds that might disturb the community above. Dr. Luther Coldwell's medical practice became a horror show of documenting injuries that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Dislocated shoulders from prayer positions, severe dehydration from spiritual fasting, psychological breaks that left children speaking in whispers or not speaking at all. But the most disturbing development was how normal it all became. Children who survived Vexler's ministry would return to their families docile and obedient. Parents praised the transformation. The community celebrated these spiritual victories as proof that their methods worked. Thaddeus Merkwater ran the town's only general store, and his position gave him a unique perspective on how thoroughly Salvation Creek had been corrupted. He saw parents purchasing rope and restraints under the guise of church supplies. He noticed families buying medical supplies in quantities that suggested serious injuries were being treated at home. Most tellingly, he watched as the town's children stopped playing. The laughter that had once echoed through Salvation Creek's dirt streets disappeared entirely. Children moved in careful, measured steps. They spoke only when spoken to. They had learned that spontaneity could be dangerous. Merkwater began keeping his own records, documenting purchases and behavioral changes with the methodical precision of a man who understood he was witnessing history. His ledgers would later reveal the economic infrastructure that supported systematic abuse, how an entire community had reorganized itself around the needs of torturers. From Thaddeus Merkwater's store ledger, April 3, 1932, Vexler family purchased 6 yards hemp rope, bottle iodine, rolls gauze. Third, such purchase this month. Mary Vexler's hands shake when she counts coins. The transformation of Salvation Creek accelerated after Rebecca's death because the community had proven to itself that it could collectively ignore even the most obvious atrocity. If they could watch a child die and call it salvation, what couldn't they rationalize? Vexler understood this psychology better than anyone. He began expanding his methods beyond the chapel basement, encouraging parents to implement purification techniques in their own homes. He provided detailed instructions for breaking a child's will while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods involved. The genius of Vexler's system was its decentralization. By spreading responsibility across multiple families, he made it impossible for any single incident to bring down the entire operation. Every parent became complicit. Every family became invested in maintaining the secret. But Wechsler's appetite for control was growing, and his experiments were becoming more ambitious. He had begun to believe that proper conditioning could remake human nature entirely, and he had identified his next test subject. 8-year-old Samuel Wechsler hadn't spoken a word in 14 months, but his silence wasn't natural. It was engineered with the same methodical precision his stepfather brought to everything else. What the congregation saw was a perfectly obedient child who never cried, never complained, never showed fear. What they couldn't see was the systematic destruction of a human spirit that had taken place behind closed doors. Sometimes the most horrific crimes hide behind the facade of perfect behavior. The Wechsler household operated with clockwork precision. The sound of Samuel's bare feet on cold wooden floors at exactly 5:30 every morning, the smell of lye soap that burned skin and nostrils alike, and the texture of rough wool clothing that chafed until it drew blood. Jedediah had transformed child-rearing into a science of control. Samuel had become Jedediah's masterpiece, proof that human consciousness could be completely rewritten through proper application of pressure and pain. The boy moved through his daily routine like a wind-up toy, performing each task with mechanical efficiency, but showing no spark of individual thought or desire. From Jedediah Wechsler's personal journal, June 15, 1932, Samuel's conditioning reaches new milestone. No longer responds to his given name, unless preceded by vessel. Shows complete compliance with all directives. Ready for advanced programming. The journal detailed Jedediah's methods with clinical detachment, sleep deprivation cycles designed to increase suggestibility, nutritional restriction that weakened resistance, sensory isolation that made any human contact feel like a reward. Most disturbing were the entries about identity erasure, systematic destruction of Samuel's sense of self. Dr. Luther Coldwell had been monitoring Samuel's condition through careful observation since direct examination was forbidden. The child showed all the signs of severe psychological trauma, but presented with an eerie calm that was somehow more unsettling than obvious distress would have been. The boy's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by other families in Salvation Creek. Parents began requesting private consultations with Jedediah, seeking his guidance in achieving similar results with their own children. What had started as one man's twisted experiment was becoming a community-wide methodology. Elias Thornfield, the town's school teacher, found himself in an impossible position. Samuel attended school along with other children who had undergone various levels of purification, and the classroom had become a laboratory for studying the results of systematic psychological abuse. The children no longer interacted naturally. They formed rigid hierarchies based on their level of conditioning. Those who had undergone more extensive training held authority over newer victims. They had internalized their abusers' methods and began applying them to weaker children. Thornfield watched helplessly as Samuel became the enforcer's lieutenant, teaching other children how to suppress their natural impulses. The boy had become so thoroughly conditioned that he was now an active participant in his own abuse system, helping to break the spirits of children who still retained some spark of independence. From Elias Thornfield's teaching notes, September 2, 1932, Samuel Wechsler demonstrates advanced conditioning techniques to younger students during recess. Other children defer to his authority without question. Natural play behaviors have been eliminated from school environment. What made the situation even more tragic was that Samuel occasionally showed flickers of his original personality, moments when confusion or fear would cross his features before being quickly suppressed. These glimpses suggested that somewhere beneath the conditioning, the real child still existed, trapped and screaming silently. The success of Samuel's transformation attracted attention from beyond Salvation Creek. Jedediah began corresponding with like-minded individuals in other isolated communities, sharing techniques and comparing results. What had started as one family's perversion was evolving into a network of systematic child abuse disguised as spiritual practice. Gideon Blackwell, a traveling merchant who occasionally passed through Salvation Creek, noticed the changes in the town's children during his visits. His route took him through dozens of mountain communities, and he had never seen anything like what was happening in Salvation Creek. Blackwell began documenting his observations, perhaps sensing that he was witnessing something historically significant. His notes captured the eerie quality of a town where children moved like ghosts and adults spoke of suffering as if it were the weather. But Blackwell's curiosity would prove dangerous because Jedediah Wexler had developed a particular sensitivity to outside observation, and he had already begun planning how to deal with anyone who looked too closely at his work. Gideon Blackwell's trading wagon creaked to a halt outside Merkwater's general store on a crisp October morning in 1932. But this time, the usual sounds of children playing in the streets were replaced by an oppressive silence that made his horses nervous. What he discovered during his 3-day stay would force him to choose between his own safety and exposing a horror that had consumed an entire community. When witnesses become targets, silence becomes survival. The store's interior carried the familiar sense of leather goods and preserved meat, but underneath lay something metallic and sharp that caught in Blackwell's throat. Thaddeus Merkwater moved behind his counter with the careful precision of a man who had learned that every word carried weight. While outside the window, children walked past in perfect formation, like tiny soldiers. Blackwell had been trading through these mountains for 15 years, and his merchant's eye was trained to notice details that others missed. The quality of rope being purchased, the quantities of medical supplies, the way conversations stopped when strangers entered rooms. Salvation Creek was operating under rules that existed nowhere else. From Gideon Blackwell's Trading Journal, October 7, 1932. Children here move differently. No running, no shouting, no games. Parents speak of discipline with religious fervor. Something fundamental has changed since my last visit. During his first evening at the boarding house, Blackwell witnessed what locals called a correction session. A 6-year-old girl had apparently smiled during evening prayers, a violation of proper spiritual demeanor, according to Jedediah Wexler's increasingly rigid interpretations of acceptable behavior. The session took place in full view of the boarding house's main room. The child was made to kneel on rough stones while Wexler lectured about the dangers of inappropriate joy. Other children watched with the focused attention of students studying an important lesson. None of the adults intervened. Blackwell found himself faced with a moral dilemma that had no clean solution. Direct confrontation would likely result in his expulsion from the town, or worse. But documentation meant becoming complicit through inaction. Yet he understood that someone needed to create a record of what was happening. The merchant's trained observation skills revealed layers of systematic control that casual visitors would miss. Children were assigned specific walking routes through town. Conversations followed scripted patterns that eliminated spontaneity. Even play had been replaced with structured activities designed to reinforce hierarchical submission. Most disturbing was the way families had reorganized themselves around Wexler's methodology. Parents competed to demonstrate their children's level of conditioning. Siblings were encouraged to report each other's violations of behavioral codes. The family unit had become a laboratory for studying the destruction of natural human bonds. Blackwell's presence hadn't gone unnoticed by Jedediah Wexler, who made a point of introducing himself to the traveling merchant. The conversation revealed a man who had developed sophisticated justifications for his methods, framing systematic abuse as advanced spiritual practice that outsiders couldn't understand. From Jedediah Wexler's personal journal, October 8, 1932. Merchant Blackwell asks too many questions. His observations could complicate our work. May require direct intervention to protect the community's spiritual progress. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Wechsler had surrounded himself with completely conditioned followers who would carry out any instruction without question. Children who had been broken so thoroughly that they would participate in their own abuse. Parents who had invested so much in the system that they couldn't afford to let anyone challenge it. On his final night in Salvation Creek, Blackwell was approached by Dr. Luther Coldwell, who had been watching the merchant's careful documentation with growing hope. The doctor had spent months looking for someone with the credibility and connections to expose what was happening. Coldwell provided Blackwell with copies of his medical records evidence that could support any official investigation, but both men understood the risks involved. Wechsler's influence extended beyond Salvation Creek, and his network of correspondence included individuals in positions of authority throughout the region. The question that haunted both men was whether the outside world would believe what they had documented. The systematic conditioning of an entire community seemed too extreme, too coordinated to be credible. They were asking people to accept that dozens of families had willingly participated in the destruction of their own children. As Blackwell prepared to leave Salvation Creek, he noticed Samuel Wechsler watching him from an upstairs window. For just a moment, the child's carefully maintained expression cracked, revealing desperate pleading in his eyes before the mask of perfect compliance returned. But Blackwell's departure wouldn't end his involvement with Salvation Creek because Jedediah Wechsler had already decided that some witnesses posed too great a threat to be allowed to leave with their knowledge intact. Gideon Blackwell's wagon was found overturned in Harrow's Gap 3 days after leaving Salvation Creek. His trading goods scattered across the mountain road, like offerings to whatever had dragged him into the woods. The official report blamed bears, but the methodical arrangement of his belongings suggested something far more deliberate and far more human. When the first witness disappears, the conspiracy reveals its true scope. The search party led by Sheriff Cyrus Hallograve moved through the dense pine forest with practiced efficiency, the crunch of fallen needles underfoot, mixing with the acrid scent of fear sweat that no amount of mountain air could cleanse. What they found 50 yards from the road wasn't just evidence of violence. It was proof that Jedediah Wechsler's influence had spread far beyond the borders of Salvation Creek. Blackwell's body bore the systematic markings of someone who had been subjected to advanced purification techniques. The positioning was too careful, too ritualistic to be the work of wild animals. Someone had taken considerable time to demonstrate their mastery of pain as both art and science. From Sheriff Cyrus Hallograve's incident report, October 14th, 1932, merchant's death shows signs of prolonged torture. Methods, consistent with reports from other jurisdictions, recommend coordinated investigation across 3 counties. But Hallograve's recommendation would never be implemented because the sheriff himself had been receiving monthly payments from a network of families who shared Wechsler's philosophical approach to child rearing. The corruption extended through multiple layers of local government, creating a protective wall around communities that had embraced systematic abuse. The network had been growing quietly for almost 4 years. Families like the Darkmoors in Virginia, the Thornfields in North Carolina, and the Merkwaters in Tennessee had all developed their own variations on Wechsler's techniques. They corresponded regularly, sharing innovations and comparing results like scientists advancing a common research project. Each family had learned to exploit their community's isolation and economic desperation. Coal mining towns, logging camps, and subsistence farming communities provided perfect laboratory conditions, places where outside authority was weak and local control could be absolute. Obadiah Darkmoor had been among Wechsler's earliest correspondents, and his letters revealed the intellectual framework that justified their shared practices. They weren't abusing children. They were conducting crucial research into human malleability that could benefit all of society. They were discovering fundamental truths about consciousness that academia was too squeamish to explore. The families had developed sophisticated methods for identifying potential recruits. They looked for communities under economic stress, religious leaders who preached absolute obedience, and parents who had already shown willingness to use severe physical discipline. Once they identified suitable candidates, integration was surprisingly easy. Dr. Luther Coldwell's medical practice had become an unwitting intelligence center for tracking the network's expansion. Injured children would appear in neighboring counties with identical patterns of systematic abuse. The same techniques, the same careful documentation of psychological breaking points, the same clinical approach to destroying human will. From Dr. Luther Coldwell's confidential notes, November 3, 1932. Darkmoor family cases match Wechsler methodology exactly. Network appears to be sharing detailed protocols. Children being transported between locations for advanced training. The transportation of children between network families represented a new level of coordination. Parents would voluntarily send their children to other communities for spiritual education that lasted months or years. These exchanges allowed families to experiment with children who had no local community connections, making resistance or rescue virtually impossible. What made the network particularly dangerous was its ability to appear legitimate to outside observers. Each family maintained the facade of devout religious practice. Their communities praised them for their children's exceptional behavior. Local authorities saw only well-disciplined families who caused no trouble. The death of Gideon Blackwell sent a clear message to anyone who might consider exposing the network's activities, but it also revealed that the families were no longer content to operate in complete isolation. They were beginning to eliminate threats with the same systematic precision they applied to conditioning children. Sheriff Hallowgrave found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His monthly payments from the network families had made him complicit in their activities, but Blackwell's murder represented an escalation that could draw unwanted federal attention. The balance between protection and exposure was becoming impossible to maintain. As winter approached Salvation Creek, Jedediah Wechsler was already planning the network's next phase of expansion. The successful elimination of one witness had proven that their methods could be applied beyond child conditioning. They were ready to test whether entire communities could be remade according to their vision. But their success had also attracted the attention of someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or disappeared. Someone who understood that some evils must be stopped regardless of the personal cost. Agent Theodore Hawthorne stepped off the train at Millfield Station on a bitter February morning in 1933, carrying only a worn leather satchel and a reputation for pursuing cases that other federal agents preferred to avoid. The telegram that had brought him to Appalachia contained just 7 words, but they were enough to convince him that something unprecedented was happening in these mountains. When children become ghosts in their own communities, someone must speak for the dead. The station platform reeked of coal smoke and desperation, the sound of departing locomotives echoing off mountain walls that seemed designed to swallow secrets whole. Hawthorne's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he studied the carefully prepared files that documented a pattern of systematic abuse spanning multiple states and dozens of families. The investigation had begun almost by accident. A postal inspector in Richmond had noticed unusual correspondence patterns between remote mountain communities' letters that used coded language about spiritual advancement and purification techniques. When, combined with reports of missing children and unexplained deaths, the pattern suggested something that required federal intervention. From FBI Case File 33278, February 18, 1933. Subject communities demonstrate coordinated behavior modification programs targeting children. Preliminary evidence suggests interstate conspiracy involving systematic, psychological, and physical abuse. Hawthorne had spent 15 years investigating organized crime, but nothing had prepared him for the sophistication of what he found in Appalachia. The network operated with corporate-level efficiency, complete with standardized training materials, performance metrics, and quality control measures. They had industrialized child abuse. His first stop was a meeting with Dr. Luther Coldwell, whose medical records provided the most comprehensive documentation of the network's activities. The doctor's files revealed the scientific methodology behind what appeared to be random cruelty, carefully calibrated applications of pain, designed to achieve specific psychological results. The medical evidence was overwhelming, but legal prosecution would require testimony from witnesses who were still alive. Most of the children had been so thoroughly conditioned that they couldn't distinguish between abuse and normal treatment. Many adults had become so invested in the system that admitting its nature would require acknowledging their own complicity. Hawthorne's investigation revealed that the network had been studying federal law enforcement procedures with the same systematic attention they applied to child conditioning. They had identified weaknesses in interstate communication, jurisdictional boundaries that could be exploited, and political pressure points that could derail investigations. Sheriff Cyrus Hallowgrave had been feeding information about potential federal interest to network families for months. Warning systems were in place to sanitize evidence and relocate key personnel whenever outside authority showed interest. The corruption extended through multiple levels of local government. But the network had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the determination of someone who understood that some crimes transcend normal law enforcement boundaries. Hawthorne wasn't just investigating criminal activity. He was documenting a systematic assault on human consciousness that threatened the foundations of civilized society. From Agent Theodore Hawthorne's field notes, March 2nd, 1933. Network demonstrates unprecedented coordination in child abuse methodology. Evidence suggests shared training protocols and performance standards. Subjects exhibit identical psychological conditioning patterns across multiple jurisdictions. The breakthrough came when Hawthorne located Samuel Vexler, who had been transferred to a training facility operated by the Darkmoor family in Virginia. The boy's condition provided living proof of the network's capabilities and its complete disregard for human dignity. Samuel couldn't speak coherently about his experiences, but his behavioral patterns revealed the systematic destruction of natural human responses. He had been conditioned to view pain as love, isolation as security, and submission as spiritual achievement. The transformation was so complete that reversal might be impossible. Hawthorne understood that prosecuting the network would require extraordinary measures. Normal legal procedures couldn't address crimes that had been normalized within entire communities. He needed evidence that would shock the broader public into demanding action regardless of jurisdictional complications. The agent began coordinating with federal authorities in multiple states, building a case that would expose the network's full scope. But he was racing against time because network families had identified him as a threat and were already implementing their most extreme contingency protocols. Jedediah Vexler had spent months preparing for the possibility of federal intervention. His response wouldn't just eliminate the immediate threat. It would send a message that would deter future investigations for decades to come. The explosion that leveled Salvation Creek's chapel at 4:17 a.m. on March 15, 1933, could be heard 20 miles away, but the screams that preceded it had been muffled by thick stone walls that Jedediah Vexler had specifically reinforced for his final demonstration. Agent Theodore Hawthorne arrived to find a crater where the building had stood, and evidence that the network had chosen collective destruction over federal prosecution. When cornered predators choose annihilation, they reveal the true depths of their commitment to evil. The blast site reeked of sulfur and charred wood, the acrid smell of dynamite mixing with something sweetly organic that made rescue workers gag behind improvised masks. What Hawthorne discovered in the rubble wasn't just the aftermath of an explosion. It was evidence of a carefully orchestrated murder-suicide that had eliminated dozens of witnesses and destroyed years of documentation. Wexler's final journal, found in a fireproof safe buried beneath the chapel's foundation, revealed the network's ultimate contingency plan. Rather than allow their methods to be exposed and their children to be corrupted by outside intervention, participating families had agreed to implement what they called the ultimate purification. From Jedediah Wexler's final entry, March 14, 1933, federal interference proves that the outside world will never understand our work. Better to preserve our achievements through sacrifice than allow them to be perverted by those who lack vision. The children will finally achieve perfect peace. The explosion had been timed to occur during a special purification ceremony that brought together network families from 3 states. Parents, children, and network leaders had gathered in the chapel's basement for what participants believed would be an advanced spiritual ritual. Instead, it became a mass execution disguised as religious transcendence. Hawthorne's investigation revealed that similar explosions had occurred simultaneously at network facilities in Virginia and North Carolina. The Darkmoor compound, the Thornfield Spiritual Retreat, and the Merkwater family's training center had all been destroyed within minutes of each other, eliminating physical evidence and human witnesses with surgical precision. The coordination required for the network's self-destruction demonstrated the same systematic thinking that had characterized their abuse methodology. They had planned every detail, from the placement of explosives to the timing of final gatherings, with the clinical precision of military strategists. Dr. Luther Coldwell had survived only because Agent Hawthorne had moved him to protective custody the day before the explosions. His medical records became the primary evidence of the network's activities. But without living witnesses, prosecution became nearly impossible. The families had achieved their goal of taking their secrets to the grave. Sheriff Cyrus Hallograve's body was found in his office with a single gunshot wound and a signed confession that detailed his financial relationship with network families. The document implicated dozens of local officials across multiple states, but most of the named individuals had also died in the coordinated explosions or subsequent suicides. The federal investigation continued for 18 months, but the network's final gambit had been devastatingly effective. Without witnesses or physical evidence, prosecutors couldn't build cases that would survive legal challenges. The few surviving children were too damaged to provide coherent testimony, and local communities closed ranks around stories of tragic accidents. From FBI Final Report, Case 33-278, September 30th, 1934. Network successfully eliminated evidence and witnesses through coordinated destruction. Insufficient evidence remains for criminal prosecution. Recommend monitoring surviving children for signs of continued abuse. Agent Hawthorne spent the remainder of his career tracking similar networks, but never found another organization with the scope and sophistication of the Appalachian families. The explosion at Salvation Creek had sent a clear message to other potential conspirators. Some secrets were worth dying to protect. The abandoned communities slowly disappeared from maps as vegetation reclaimed the blast sites and official records were sealed or destroyed. Within a decade, most traces of the network's existence had been erased from public memory, leaving only scattered medical records and federal files that few people would ever see. But the network's legacy lived on in the surviving children, whose psychological conditioning proved remarkably resistant to therapeutic intervention. Some never learned to speak normally. Others struggled with basic human emotions for decades. The damage they carried served as living proof of what systematic evil could accomplish, given sufficient time and isolation. Some say that on quiet nights in the abandoned hollows where the network once operated, you can still hear the sound of children's voices reciting lessons in perfect unison conditioning, so complete that it echoes beyond death itself. Years later, When Hawthorne was asked about the case that defined his career, he would only say that some investigations reveal truths too dark for official records, and that the real horror wasn't what the families had done to their children, but how completely they had convinced themselves it was necessary. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops. The Appalachian Research Institute sealed files, discovered during a routine archive transfer in 1998, contain photographs that made seasoned investigators physically ill, images that proved the network's influence had survived the explosions of 1933 and evolved into something even more sophisticated. What researchers found wasn't just historical documentation, but evidence that systematic child conditioning had become an academic discipline practiced in institutions across the country. The most terrifying monsters are those who teach others to become monsters. The archive room smelled of decay and forgotten secrets, filled with the musty odor of deteriorating paper and the metallic tang of old photographic chemicals. Inside filing cabinets that hadn't been opened for 60 years, researchers discovered training manuals, progress reports, and correspondence that revealed how the network's methodology had been preserved and refined by survivors who understood that true influence comes through institutional legitimacy. Dr. Elias Thornfield had escaped the Virginia explosion because he was attending a research conference at a private facility in Pennsylvania. Rather than viewing the network's destruction as defeat, he saw it as an opportunity to establish their methods within the respected framework of academic research and therapeutic practice. From the Thornfield Institute Annual Report, 1937, our residential treatment programs demonstrate remarkable success in modifying problematic childhood behaviors. Patients show complete compliance with institutional protocols within 6 to 8 weeks of admission. The Institute had operated for 43 years, serving children from families who could afford private treatment for behavioral disorders. What parents believed was cutting-edge therapeutic intervention was actually the systematic application of conditioning, techniques developed by the original network families, refined through decades of practice and dressed in the language of medical science. Thornfield had recruited other network survivors as faculty members, creating an institution where child abuse could be practiced under the protection of professional credentials and therapeutic terminology. Parents paid thousands of dollars to have their children subjected to the same techniques that had destroyed an entire generation in Appalachian communities. The Institute's patient records revealed the industrial scale of their operations. Over 4 decades, they had processed more than 3,000 children, each subjected to carefully documented conditioning protocols that broke down natural resistance and rebuilt personality according to institutional specifications. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that the Institute had been training other professionals in their methods. Psychiatrists, social workers, and educational administrators had attended workshops where Thornfield's techniques were presented as innovative approaches to childhood behavioral modification. By the 1960s, Institute graduates were working in schools, hospitals, and residential facilities across the country, carrying refined versions of the network's conditioning methodology into mainstream institutions. What had begun as isolated family abuse had evolved into a systematic approach to child development practiced by credentialed professionals. Government investigations in the 1970s had identified problematic practices at several facilities connected to Institute-trained staff, but the academic veneer made prosecution nearly impossible. Professional review boards dismissed concerns as misunderstandings of advanced therapeutic techniques. From Congressional Hearing Transcript, House Subcommittee on Child Welfare, July 22, 1976. Dr. 20. Thornfield's methodologies represent innovative approaches to treating severe behavioral disorders. Critics fail to understand the scientific basis for apparent harsh measures. The Institute's influence extended beyond direct training programs. Thornfield had authored textbooks that were used in graduate programs at major universities, ensuring that his conditioning principles would be integrated into mainstream professional education. Thousands of therapists and educators had unknowingly absorbed techniques designed to break children's psychological resistance. Agent Theodore Hawthorne, now retired, was contacted during the archive investigation. His review of the newly discovered documents confirmed his long-held suspicion that the network's destruction had been a tactical retreat rather than defeat. The families had understood that survival required evolution. The files contained correspondence between Thornfield and other survivors who had established similar institutions under different names. The network had fragmented and adapted, but its core mission remained unchanged: the systematic conditioning of children, according to principles that viewed human consciousness as infinitely malleable material. What made the discovery even more chilling was the realization that many institute-trained professionals were still working in their fields, carrying forward techniques they might not even recognize as abusive. The network's influence had become so thoroughly integrated into professional practice that identifying and eliminating it would require dismantling entire systems of childcare. The archive investigation was quietly terminated after 18 months, and the files were transferred to federal custody under national security classifications. Official explanations cited ongoing investigations that required confidentiality. But former investigators understood that some truths were too destabilizing for public consumption. Today, whenever a case of systematic institutional abuse surfaces, experienced investigators quietly check for connections to institute-trained staff or Thornfield's published methodologies. The network's legacy lives on in professional practices that transform children's natural development into exercises in control and submission. In rural communities across Appalachia, elderly residents still speak in whispers about families who disappeared in the 1930s and children who survived experiences that left them forever changed. They understand that some mountains keep secrets that refuse to stay buried. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.